So let's start with a history of advertising media in the USA. So basically, the overview, we're going to go into a little bit more detail. First, there was, actually that's out of home advertising. In fact, the out of home advertising industry, and that means billboards and bus shelters and even stadium advertising, and basically any kind of poster sort of advertising that's not in your home. The annual creative awards for the industry are called the OBIE Awards, OBIE, and these are often confused maybe by some people with the Off-Broadway Awards, which are also, I think, called OBIE, which are like acting and other awards for off-Broadway shows. They're called the OBIEs because OBIE stands, believe it or not, for obelisk. And so the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, etc., used out-of-home advertising and signs and things like that to say where things were. So it's argued that out-of-home advertising is not just the first form of advertising in the U.S., but also in the world. So then local newspapers came along, and there used to be a huge, vital, throbbing business with many, many local newspapers competing in each city. In fact, Benjamin Franklin published a newspaper. Magazines eventually came along when there was color reproduction and photography. And there were national magazines that a lot of people read. Very vital business at one point. And then broadcast started with radio and the invention of radio, and the first network for commercial purposes was started by CBS by a man named William Paley, who was also one of the first to start broadcasting television. And then, of course, we have the internet, the information superhighway, coming along in the last 30 years or so. And, of course, mobile is now where a lot of things seem to be going, and it's the current almost vehicle of choice for many people, and growing faster than anything else at this point. And obviously some of the earlier forms, particularly newspapers and magazines, and to some degree radio, are not growing. In fact, they're declining. Out of home actually is holding its own and even growing a little bit. There's some kind of interesting reasons for that have to do with the fact that I mentioned earlier that out of home is unavoidable. So now let's go through all of this in a little bit more detail. And this is an early out of home ad that ran, actually, I would say not in the US, but in the UK, in Britain. And people used to print these and then go around with glue and glue them up in different parts of a town. There were kind of town bulletin boards and message boards, but these were glued in certain places all over a town. And this particular ad is actually seeing if people want to go to Virginia, to the New World. And there you go. And it even says who printed it. And so the date is 1609. And then moving fast forwarding a little bit to World War I. Here's a color poster, but distributed much the same way that earlier bill was distributed. People would go and glue these up in different spots all over a city. they tended to be fairly small. They were like one sheet, maybe 3 by 6 feet at the largest. But also, I'd just like you to see that this actually is, I think, could be argued as a very effective piece of communication, very effective out of home. Like all good out of home, it's not very wordy. There's a lot of contrast between the text and the background, except for the U.S. Army part on the bottom. I think you could argue could be a little bolder, frankly. Good out of home needs to be legible at a distance. But all good out of home also needs to have a visual or something about it that's involving, that kind of involves your brain to process it for a minute or two. And this one, it's got a very stark and dramatic visual. So it's a pretty effective poster. In fact, think about it, a lot of artists, famous designers, made a lot of posters at one point. This is more modern. This, I think, is probably in the 60s. It's a neon sign, and it's really doesn't get into, if I asked you to do a Tabasco on this, it wouldn't have much to say. It's basically just a brand name. So out of home, and out of home we'll get into in some more detail. It's even more vital now than it was some time ago, I think, in some ways. It's also going digital, which is another interesting phenomenon. Local newspapers, as I said before, there were often many, many newspapers in each city, and people were anxious to get hold of them and read them. This was the primary means of, getting the news every day, every week. And this one was in Pennsylvania. It might have been the one that Franklin published. I don't recall yet where I got this. And this one, the New York Herald Tribune. So fast forwarding again from the 1700s in Boston and Philadelphia with these little newspapers, we go to the 100 years later or so, with Abraham Lincoln ran for president. I don't know if you knew this, but there wasn't any political advertising. Zero. Zip. Of course, there were no broadcast media at that point, of course, but nevertheless, politicians could have run ads in newspapers or done posters different places and perhaps appeared in some magazines. But it was considered bad form to actually campaign in those days. So once you won the nomination of your party, you kind of sat back, and this is what Abraham Lincoln did, and let others carry the torch for you. So you didn't go around speaking. You certainly didn't advertise. And in fact, when Abraham Lincoln wanted to reach the public, he would send letters to newspaper editors. And a very famous newspaper editor was Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune. And so occasionally, Lincoln felt he had a position that needed to be clarified or whatever. He would do that by sending a letter, and then the letter would be reprinted by newspapers all over the country. And that's how he reached the population. Magazines came along in the 19th century, so in the 1800s or so. This one says, I think, is it 1909, it looks like, Scribner's Magazine. So that's one written by Teddy Roosevelt about a trip to Africa. Of course, he was a big game hunter. He thought that was a pretty manly, masculine thing to do, but he was also quite a conservationist. So, yes, he did shoot animals, but he also conserved a lot of parkland and appreciated natural spaces. Here's fast forwarding a little bit to the 1940. By the way, does anyone out there know who painted the cover of the Saturday Evening Post? What artist is that? And in fact, you can see down in the lower right-hand corner there was Norman Rockwell. I don't know if you're familiar with him, his work, but very interesting artist, captured a lot of feeling. And by the way, he did it by having models pose exactly as he wanted them. So he found someone to be a model and dress like this and have all these things. And this was not just done out of imagination. But at this point, magazines were national. Time magazine had been founded by Henry Luce. They're basically weekly or monthly, certainly not daily, the way newspapers are daily. So in terms of their content, they had time to write a little more of opinion type pieces, publish fiction, and lots of companies, cigarette companies, bought lots of ads in magazines. And of course, with a magazine, you could do 4-color, which is a point of difference versus newspapers, at least in those days, up until USA Today came out in color. We're going to stop now. So we can talk about radio, because I want to load these links for you and have you listen to some very early radio programming. Hope you kind of find it quaint and interesting.